They say the first sign of a neighborhood's death is the sound of a nail gun at 7 in the morning. I had been hearing that sound for 6 weeks, a relentless metallic heartbeat counting down the remaining hours of peace I had left in this world. My world, the one I had shared with my husband, Arthur, for nearly 50 years, was a small, brick-faced house on a quiet, tree-lined street. The kind of street that developers call undervalued property, and the people who live there just call home. The new developer, a man named Rexford Vance, had bought the adjacent lot, the one that had been a community garden since the 70s. He hadn't just bought it, he had consumed it, and now he was building a monument to his own ego, a monstrous glass box that was methodically, brutally stealing my sunlight. Before the first shovel broke ground, there was a town hall meeting. Vance stood at the front of the community center gymnasium, all sharp angles and expensive tailoring, a predator trying to blend in with a flock of sparrows. He projected slides of a sleek modernist structure, but it was a lie. The renderings were cleverly angled, minimizing its height, softening its edges, showing it nestled amongst phantom trees that didn't exist. He spoke in a language of polished corporate euphemisms. He said revitalization when he meant demolition. He said community enhancement when he meant profit. I stood up. My voice felt small in the echoing space. "I'm Mrs. Gable," I said. "Eleonora Gable. I live at number 42. Your proposed structure, Mr. Vance, according to the schematics, will cast a shadow over my property from 2 in the afternoon until sunset. I have a garden. My late husband planted those roses for me on our 10th anniversary. They need at least 6 hours of direct sunlight." Vance gave me a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. It was a practiced, dismissive smile, the kind a king might give a court jester. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I understand your concern. Truly I do. But this is a city. Progress has a shadow. It's a sign of growth, of a healthy economy. You'll get used to it." The room was silent. A few people from the neighborhood association shifted uncomfortably in their plastic chairs. They had been so full of fire a week before, promising to fight this tooth and nail, but I could see the change in their eyes. Vance's legal team, a pack of silent, grim-faced men and women sitting in the front row, had already been at work. They had sent letters, thick vellum envelopes filled with threats disguised as legal notices. They had worn down our collective will before the first battle had even begun. He thought I was just an old woman, a relic clinging to her flowers. He thought my protest was a quaint, sentimental inconvenience. He didn't know who my husband was. He didn't know what was resting in the dark, quiet study at the back of my house. And so, I sat down. I said nothing more. I let him think he had won. If you've ever felt like your voice was being erased, that your history didn't matter to the person writing the future, I need you to hit that like button and let me know I'm not just speaking into the void. It helps to know I'm not alone in this fight. The real betrayal didn't come from Vance. I expected nothing from him but greed and arrogance. The real betrayal came a week later, in a thin, white envelope slid through my mail slot. It was from the neighborhood association. The letterhead was the same, but the words were hollowed out, defeated. It spoke of a mutually beneficial settlement and a generous donation from Vance Capital to the association's general fund. It stated that, in light of this agreement, they would be withdrawing all objections to the development. They had sold our sky for a few $1,000s. They had been bullied into silence, and they had taken the buyout. I was alone. The monstrous glass box wasn't just a building anymore. It was a tombstone for the neighborhood I knew, and my little house was about to be buried in its shadow. The rhythmic pop-pop-pop of the nail guns became the soundtrack to my grief. The first few weeks after the association's surrender were a study in gray. The color seemed to leach out of everything. The sky, once a brilliant open canvas above my backyard, was now bisected by a rising skeleton of steel. The world was being reframed, and I wasn't in the picture. The shadow of Vance's creation was a physical presence. It started as a thin line across the far edge of my lawn around 2 o'clock, and then, like a slow, dark tide, it would creep across the grass, swallowing the bird bath, then the stone bench, until finally, it reached the rose bushes, Arthur's roses. They were the one piece of him I could still touch, still tend to. He had planted them one by one, a different varietal for every milestone, a Mr. Lincoln for our son's birth, a peace rose for the year his father passed, an iceberg for our 25th anniversary. Tending to them was a conversation I was still having with him. Now their leaves were starting to curl and yellow at the edges. They were starving for light, and I could do nothing but watch. That feeling of powerlessness is a cold, heavy thing. It settles in your bones. I would sit in the kitchen, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, and just stare out the window at the construction. Cranes swung girders into place with a groan of stressed metal. Men in hard hats shouted over the din of machinery. It was a world of noise and force, and I was a creature of silence and memory. I felt ancient, obsolete, a forgotten footnote in someone else's story of progress. The worst part was the loneliness. My neighbors, the same people who used to stop and chat over the fence, now averted their eyes when I was out getting the mail. They felt guilty, ashamed. Their silence was a confession of their defeat, and it isolated me more than any wall could. One rainy Tuesday, the feeling became unbearable. The construction noise was muffled by the downpour, replaced by the dreary drumming of water on the roof. The roses looked beaten down, their heavy, waterlogged heads bowed to the earth. I retreated into the house, into the one room that felt like a sanctuary, Arthur's study. It was at the back of the house, facing away from the construction, and I had kept it exactly as he had left it 3 years ago. His drafting table still stood by the window, its surface covered in a clean sheet of vellum. His books on civil engineering, cartography, and land law lined the shelves, their spines a silent testament to a life of precision and order. The room smelled of old paper, graphite, and him. I ran my hand over the smooth, cool wood of his desk, and I broke. The silent, stoic composure I had maintained for weeks, finally shattered. I leaned my forehead against the shelves, and I wept, not loud, theatrical sobs, but a quiet, gut-wrenching grief that shook my entire body. I wasn't just crying for the roses, or the sunlight, or the quiet street. I was crying for Arthur. I was crying because he would have known what to do. He would have seen this coming. Arthur understood the bones of this town. He had measured its every angle, walked its every boundary. He used to say that a town wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was a network of agreements, of promises kept over generations. He saw the world in lines and boundaries, in easements and rights of way. He saw the invisible architecture that held society together, and I missed him with an ache so profound it felt like a physical injury. As I stood there, surrounded by his life's work, memories started to surface, sharp and clear. I remembered him coming home late one night, smelling of damp earth and frustration. He'd been dealing with a developer back in the 80s, a man much like Vance, who wanted to build a gated community that would cut off a traditional path fishermen used to get to the river. Arthur had spent a week in the town archives, digging through dusty, forgotten records until he found the original charter from 1890, which explicitly guaranteed public access to the riverbank. He hadn't fought the developer with anger or rhetoric. He had fought him with a fact, a single, unassailable line in a 100-year-old document, and he had won. I remembered him sitting at this very desk, unrolling a huge, crackling map and telling me, "The paper remembers, Ellie. Even when the people forget, the paper remembers." Another memory, years later. We were walking near the old part of town, by the abandoned mill. He stopped and pointed to a barely there path overgrown with weeds. "See that?" he said. "That was the original cart path to the old town well. People have forgotten the well, but the path is still here. In the town records, it's not just a path, it's a promise, a public access easement. It can't be built on, it can't be sold, it belongs to everyone, which means it belongs to no one." He had a reverence for these things, these invisible threads connecting the past to the present. He saw them as sacred. And then, I remembered Ben Carter. He was a young man, barely 30, a lawyer who had moved into the old Miller house down the street a year ago. His grandfather had been one of Arthur's oldest friends. Ben was the one the association had sent to deliver the letter of surrender. He had stood on my porch, his face a mask of professional regret, but his eyes were filled with a shame so deep it was painful to see. He had apologized, saying his hands were tied, that Vance's legal team was a leviathan and he was just a guppy. I had been polite, thanked him, and closed the door. But now, thinking about him, I saw not a coward, but a young man who had been forced to betray his own ideals. He was a casualty, just like my roses. He was part of the fallout. These memories, swirling in the quiet of the study, weren't making me sad anymore. They were forging something new inside me. The grief was burning away, leaving behind something hard and cold. It was the catalyst. It was the turning point from despair to resolve. My tears dried up, my breathing steadied. I stood up straight. I wasn't a powerless old woman waiting for her world to be buried. I was Arthur Gable's wife, and I was standing in his armory. My eyes scanned the room, no longer seeing relics of the past, but tools. I walked over to a tall, narrow cabinet in the corner. One Arthur had called his legacy cabinet. It held his most important work, the original surveys and deeds he had drawn by hand before everything went digital. I opened the heavy oak door. Inside, rolls of parchment and linen were neatly stored in labeled cardboard tubes. My fingers, trembling slightly, traced the faded ink on the labels. Miller Farm Division, 1968. Downtown Redevelopment Survey, 1974. And then at the very bottom, a tube simply marked Elm Street Block, Original Survey and Deeds, 1927. My heart didn't leap, it settled. A deep, quiet calm washed over me. I pulled the tube out. It felt heavy, substantial. I walked over to the drafting table, cleared my throat, and unrolled the contents. It wasn't paper, it was linen, heavy and yellowed with age, the kind of material that was meant to last for centuries. The ink was India ink, black and permanent. It was a map, a work of art, a legal document of breathtaking precision. It showed our entire block as it was in 1927. There was my house, there was the lot where the Miller house now stood, and there was the adjacent lot, the one Vance now owned. My finger, thin and wrinkled, traced the property lines Arthur had so carefully re-inked and annotated when he'd recertified the survey in 1955. And then I saw it. It wasn't a bold line. It was faint, almost a whisper, a series of delicate dashed marks, running from the street, straight through the middle of Vance's lot, and ending at a small circle marked Old Town Well. And alongside the dashed line, in tiny, perfect script, were the words Public Access Easement, per Town Charter, Volva, in perpetuity, a promise with no expiration date. A quiet heat flushed up my neck. It wasn't about the sunlight anymore. It wasn't even about the roses. It was about a line on a map. It was about a promise made to the future. A promise Rexford Vance, in his arrogance, had never even bothered to look for. He thought he was building on a clear lot. He had no idea he was building on hallowed ground. I stood there, in the quiet of the study, the hand-drawn deed spread out before me like a declaration of war. And I knew exactly what I had to do. The grief was gone. In its place was a cold, clean, architectural certainty. I was going to dismantle his world, not with a wrecking ball, but with a piece of paper. The days that followed were a quiet flurry of methodical activity. The roar of the construction site next door became a distant, irrelevant noise. My focus had narrowed to the task at hand, a feeling I remembered from watching Arthur work. He had a way of shutting out the world, of entering a state of pure, uncluttered concentration. I was now inside that state. It felt like coming home. My first task was to understand the battlefield. I spent hours at my computer, a device I had previously used only for emails and recipes, and delved into the town's digital archives. The interface was clunky and counterintuitive, a bureaucratic labyrinth designed by committee. But I was patient. I learned its bizarre logic. I cross-referenced the information on Arthur's linen deed, the charter volume, the page number, with the digital records, and there it was, buried, misindexed under a clerical error from the 1970s, filed under Public Waterworks instead of Easements and Rights of Way. It was a ghost in the machine, a digital whisper that Vance's high-priced legal team, with their standard keyword-based title searches, had completely missed. They had been looking for a flashing red light, and this was a faded inscription on a forgotten stone. They had the arrogance of the modern man, believing that if something wasn't easily searchable, it didn't exist. They never accounted for the meticulous analog world of my husband. This was the core of my plan. The foresight wasn't mine, it was Arthur's. He had preserved the physical truth, and now I had found its digital echo. The two together were an irrefutable weapon, but a weapon is useless without a soldier to wield it. I needed an ally. I needed Ben Carter. I didn't call him. I didn't want a digital record of our communication. I wrote a simple note. Mr. Carter, I would appreciate a moment of your time. Eleonora Gable, and walked down the street and put it in his mailbox myself. 2 days later, he knocked on my door. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped with a weight that seemed too heavy for his young frame. He started to apologize again for the association's decision, but I held up a hand. That's not why I asked you here, Ben. Come in. I led him not to the living room but to the study. The linen deed was still spread out on the drafting table. He walked over to it, his lawyer's curiosity piqued. He looked at the beautiful, archaic drawing, then his eyes narrowed, catching the faint dashed line. What is this? He asked, his voice a low murmur. That, I said, is the original 1927 survey map for this block, recertified by my late husband in 19... He was the town surveyor for 40 years. Ben leaned closer, his finger hovering over the inscription. Public access easement, in perpetuity. His breath caught. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning excitement. Is this real? Is it recorded? It is, I said calmly. I pointed to the notation, and I found the corresponding digital record. It's buried, but it's there. Vance's team missed it. Ben was speechless for a full minute. He just stared at the map, then at me, then back at the map. The defeated slump was gone. It was as if I had just administered a shot of pure adrenaline to his soul. This changes everything, he finally whispered. An easement in perpetuity, especially one tied to the town charter, isn't something you can just buy your way out of. It's a public trust. Oh, it's debatable in court. They'll argue it was abandoned because the well is gone. But the legal precedent for public trust easements is incredibly strong. It's a cannonball. Exactly, I said. And right now, Mr. Vance is happily building his foundation directly on top of it. Ben's mind was racing now. I could see the gears turning. The idealist I had sensed in him, the one who had been beaten down, was reawakening. We need to file for an injunction immediately, he said. We need to stop the work before they go any further. No, I said. My voice was quiet but firm. Ben looked at me confused. That was the moment. The moment of my own debatable, questionable logic. A more reasonable person would have acted immediately to prevent further damage. But I wasn't feeling reasonable. I had absorbed the cold calculation of the situation. It wasn't about stopping him. It was about letting him complete his mistake. We wait, I continued. We wait until the foundation is poured. We wait until the concrete is cured. We wait until the money he has sunk into that hole in the ground is so significant that it can't be recovered. He dealt my neighborhood a fatal blow without a thought for the consequences. I want him to feel the full, unmitigated consequences of his own arrogance. Let him build his monument. The deeper the foundation, the deeper the fall. Ben stared at me, a new kind of respect in his eyes. He saw that I was no longer just a sweet old lady who liked roses. I was a strategist. He nodded slowly. Okay, Mrs. Gable, okay, we do it your way. Our alliance was forged in that moment. Ben became my field commander. He took the linen deed to a trusted contact at the county records office, a woman who had worked with Arthur for years. She authenticated it, providing a notarized affidavit testifying to its authenticity and its place in the official town records. We made high-resolution certified copies. The original went into a safe deposit box at the bank. Ben began preparing the legal filings in secret, drafting the petition for injunction, the quiet title action, and a mountain of supporting case law. He worked from his home office late at night, fueled by coffee and a newfound sense of purpose. His subplot was no longer about his own defeat. It was about his redemption. Meanwhile, I played my part. The part of the grieving, powerless old woman. I tended to my dying roses. I offered weak, sad smiles to my neighbors. I let the construction crew see me watching from my window, a picture of helpless resignation. Vance would occasionally drive by in his black German sedan, and if he saw me, he would give a magnanimous, pitying nod. He saw exactly what I wanted him to see. He had no idea that behind my lace curtains, I was watching his progress, not with despair, but with the cold, patient eye of a demolition expert. I was counting the concrete trucks. I was noting the delivery of the steel beams. Every new piece of his monument was another nail in his own coffin. People might say this was cruel, that it was a calculated act of destruction. They might be right, but as I saw it, I wasn't destroying anything. I was simply preparing to reveal a truth that had been there all along, a truth written in indelible ink on a sheet of 50-year-old linen. It wasn't about revenge, it was about a reckoning. Vance had built his house on sand, and I was just waiting for the tide to come in. The plan was in motion, the leverage was hidden in plain sight, and all we had to do was wait for the perfect moment to pull the pin. The waiting was the hardest part. Every morning, the roar of machinery next door was a fresh assault. I watched as they excavated a massive pit, the earth groaning as it was torn away. I watched as they built a complex web of rebar, a skeleton of steel waiting for a body of concrete. And then, the day came. A parade of concrete trucks, one after another, lined up on the street. For 12 straight hours they poured thousands of tons of wet gray cement into the hole, entombing the rebar, creating the massive solid foundation of Vance's glass box. I stood at my kitchen window and watched the last truck pull away. A profound, almost spiritual calm settled over me. The trap was set. The concrete was curing. His mistake was now permanent, written in stone and steel. We gave it another 2 weeks. We watched as the first floor steel beams were craned into place, bolted onto the foundation. The structure began to climb, a skeletal finger pointing at the sky that was no longer mine. Ben called me. "It's time," he said. His voice was steady, but I could hear the thrill in it. The first move was silent, almost anticlimactic. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, it was a legal maneuver, a quiet insertion of a blade into the heart of his operation. Ben filed the lawsuit and the petition for an injunction electronically with the county court. The documents were dry, emotionless, and devastating. They laid out the facts: the existence of the 1927 easement, its recertification in 1955, its permanent legal standing as a public trust, and the fact that a multi-million-dollar permanent structure was now illegally obstructing it. Attached as exhibits were the certified copy of Arthur's deed, the affidavit from the county archivist, and a current survey map showing the new foundation sitting squarely on top of the easement's path. The next morning, a court-appointed process server, a bored-looking man in a wrinkled suit, walked onto the construction site. He handed a thick envelope to the foreman, who grunted and signed for it. The foreman, a big man named Frank, who I'd seen yelling at his crew for weeks, ripped it open. I watched from my window as his face went from confusion to disbelief to rage. He shouted something into his phone, then bellowed at his crew. Work stopped. The sudden silence was more shocking than the noise had been. The crane operator cut his engine. The welders extinguished their torches. The nail guns fell silent. An eerie quiet descended over the lot. The beast had been tranquilized. The panic, I imagined, traveled up the food chain with the speed of a lit fuse. Frank the foreman called his site supervisor. The supervisor called the project manager at Vance Capital. The project manager, probably after splashing cold water on his face, walked the papers into the office of Vance's head of legal, a woman with a reputation for ferocity. I can picture the scene so clearly. The lawyer, smug and dismissive at first, reads the document. She likely scoffs, assuming it's a frivolous suit from that crazy old bat from the neighborhood meeting. Then she sees the exhibits. She sees the authenticated deed. She sees the affidavit. A cold dread would have begun to creep in. Her firm, one of the most expensive in the city, had missed it. 100-year-old easement. They had committed malpractice on a colossal scale, and their client had just poured a fortune into the mistake. Ben got the call that afternoon. It was from Vance's lawyer. Her tone was no longer ferocious. It was tight, strained. She tried to bluster, to posture. "This is a nonsense claim," she'd said. "The easement is for a well that hasn't existed in a century. It's clearly been abandoned. Ben, bless his heart, was ready. As we discussed, Mrs. Gable, he told me later, I simply quoted the case law Arthur himself had annotated in his old textbook. I told her that under this state's law, a public trust easement cannot be legally abandoned through disuse. It requires a formal act of civic decommissioning, a public hearing, and a vote by the town council. I asked her politely if she could provide the minutes from that meeting. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. She knew, and she knew that he knew, that no such meeting had ever taken place. The real chaos erupted when the local newspaper picked up the story. Ben had given an anonymous tip to a young, hungry reporter he knew. The headline the next morning was stark. Vance Tower halted. Historic deed reveals forgotten right-of-way. The story was perfect David versus Goliath material. The powerful, out-of-town developer versus the quiet, elderly widow protecting her late husband's legacy. It was a narrative no PR team could spin. The public reveal was complete. Vance wasn't just a developer anymore. He was a villain. He was the arrogant fool who hadn't done his homework. His meticulously crafted image shattered overnight. The silent takeover was no longer silent. The whole town was watching, and the monstrous, half-finished skeleton of his building stood there for all to see, a monument not to his vision, but to his spectacular, ruinous oversight. The power shift was not a sudden explosion, but a quiet, rapid erosion, like a sandcastle in a rising tide. Rexford Vance's power was built on two things: the perception of invincibility and the relentless forward momentum of money. Our quiet legal filing attacked both pillars at once. The first to crumble were his financial backers. The glass box wasn't just Vance's project, it was a web of investors, bank loans, and future commercial tenants. The stop work order and the lawsuit were a grenade tossed into that delicate web. Ben explained it to me over tea in my kitchen, the silence from the construction site next door feeling like a tangible victory. He said, "The bank that holds his construction loan has a covenant that requires the project to be free of legal encumbrances. An easement lawsuit is a massive encumbrance, so they've frozen his line of credit. He can't draw any more funds until this is resolved." The next domino to fall was the anchor tenant. A high-end national retail chain had signed a letter of intent to occupy the entire ground floor. Their legal team, seeing the news and the lawsuit, immediately invoked a contingency clause and pulled out. Their statement, which the local paper gleefully printed, cited unforeseen legal and zoning complications that create an unacceptable level of risk. The word was out. Vance's project wasn't just stalled, it was radioactive. The money was fleeing. His political capital evaporated just as quickly. The town council members who had been so eager to fast-track his permits and praise his vision suddenly developed collective amnesia. Calls from Vance and his team went to voicemail. Emails went unanswered. They were distancing themselves from the unfolding disaster, saving their own political skins. In the space of a week, Rexford Vance went from being the town's celebrated modernizer to a pariah. That's when he came to my door. It was late afternoon. I saw his black sedan pull up to the curb. He got out, not with the arrogant stride I was used to, but with a stiff, formal gait. He was alone. No lawyers, no assistants. He walked up my garden path, carefully stepping around the yellowing rose bushes, and knocked on my door. I opened it, and simply waited. The smug, condescending mask was gone. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed out with stress. The predator had become the supplicant. "Mrs. Gable," he began, his voice strained. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." I said nothing. I just looked at him, my expression neutral. He took a deep breath. "Look, what is it you want? A new garden? I can have the best landscape architects in the country design you a private botanical oasis, a greenhouse, state-of-the-art, climate-controlled. Whatever you want, we can fix this." I remained silent. His desperation was beginning to show. "Name a price," he said, his voice dropping. "For your house, I'll give you triple its market value. 4 times. You can buy a mansion on the lake, just name your price. We need to make this go away." He was trying to do the only thing he knew how to do, write a check to solve a problem. He still didn't understand. He thought this was a negotiation. "This isn't about money, Mr. Vance," I said finally. My voice was calm and even. It wasn't about the garden or the house. It was about a promise. He stared at me, his mind unable to process a motivation that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. His last-ditch effort, his desperate counteroffer, had failed because he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict. He thought he was fighting for a piece of property. He didn't realize he was fighting against a piece of history. And history, I was beginning to learn, was undefeated. The final confrontation wasn't in a courtroom or a boardroom. It was on my front porch, with the scent of my dying roses hanging in the air. Vance stood before me, his expensive suit looking rumpled, his composure completely gone. He had offered me money, gardens, a new life, anything to make the problem I represented disappear. But the problem wasn't me. The problem was a line on a map that he had ignored. He tried one last time, his voice a low plea. "Mrs. Gable, Eleonora, please, be reasonable. My entire company is on the line. People's jobs, livelihoods, think of the damage this is causing." I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something almost like pity. He was a man so accustomed to power that he was utterly lost without it. He was a king who had just discovered his throne was made of cardboard. "I remember what you said to me at the town hall meeting, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice as quiet as the evening descending around us. "You looked at me, and you said that progress has a shadow. You were right about that, but you forgot something. You forgot that some lines, once they are properly drawn, last forever. My husband drew that line. He did it to protect a promise the town made to its citizens. That promise is not for sale, not for any price." I saw the last bit of fight go out of his eyes. He finally understood. There was no deal to be made. There was no number he could write on a check. He had run into something immovable. He had lost. I didn't need to say another word. I simply turned, walked back into my house, and gently closed the door. I leaned against it, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. Checkmate. The rest was a formality, the slow, grinding process of the law confirming what was already decided. The court granted our injunction. The judge's ruling was simple and brutal in its logic. The easement was valid. Vance Capital had two options: either demolish the existing foundation and restart the project with a design that incorporated a 10-foot-wide public access path, or engineer a solution to tunnel through the existing billion-dollar foundation. The cost of either option was catastrophic. It was a choice between ruin and utter ruin. A month later, the news broke that Vance Capital had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The glass box project was their flagship, and its failure had created a black hole that consumed the entire company. The half-finished steel skeleton on the lot next door became a local landmark, a rusting monument to arrogance. The bank seized the property. The new reality settled in. The noise was gone. The silence that remained was filled with the sound of birdsong and the rustle of leaves. The sun in the afternoon once again streamed into my backyard, bathing Arthur's roses in golden light. They began to recover, new green shoots appearing, small buds starting to form. They had survived. The story of our victory spread through the neighborhood, and something remarkable happened. The shame and guilt that had kept my neighbors silent was replaced by a renewed sense of community pride. They had been reminded that they had a voice, that they had power. The neighborhood association was reformed with new, more resilient leadership. Ben Carter, now a local hero, was elected its chairman. And then came the best part. Working with a local land conservancy, the new neighborhood association managed to raise the funds to buy the lot from the bank. Their plan was not to build, but to unbuild. They would tear down the steel skeleton, remove the concrete foundation, and restore the land. They were going to create a community park. In the center of the park, they would restore the old forgotten path, and they were going to name it the Gable Path. I was no longer just the old woman in number 42. I was Mrs. Gable, the quiet guardian of the neighborhood's soul. I sat on my porch, a cup of tea in my hand, and watched as life returned to the empty lot next door. It wasn't about the revenge, I told myself. It wasn't about watching Rexford Vance fall. It was about seeing what could be built once he was gone. It was about the new beginning. In the end, It comes down to this. They will try to tell you that you are a relic, that you are small and quiet, and that your time has passed. They will build their shiny, fragile futures on top of what they believe you have forgotten, and they will call it progress. They will count on your silence. They will count on you to believe that you are powerless. Do not believe them. They thought I was just an old woman, a living ghost in a house full of memories. They didn't understand that history is not a ghost. It is a foundation. It is the ground beneath your feet. And if you build on a cracked or hollow foundation, it doesn't matter how tall your walls are or how shiny your glass is, it will all come down. This was never about revenge for me. It was about respect. Respect for the lines, for the promises, and for the simple, enduring truth that some things are not meant to be built over. They are meant to be honored. The world is full of people like Rexford Vance, people who believe their will is the only law that matters, but it is also full of people like Arthur, people who draw the lines, who keep the records, who build things to last. And it is full of people like us, who have the quiet courage to remember. The day they dedicated the new park was bright and clear. A small bronze plaque was set in a stone at the entrance to the gable path. It didn't have my name on it. It had Arthur's words, "The lines on the map are the promises a town makes to its future." I stood there with Ben, watching children run down the path where a concrete slab once sat, and I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. The sunlight was on my face. The world was back in balance. If my story has meant something to you, if it has reminded you of the strength you hold, then please do me a favor, like this video, and leave a comment below sharing a time when you had to stand up for something that mattered. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and please, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so we can continue to share these stories and remind each other that we are not powerless and we are not alone. Thank you for listening.